Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to look at how to use API keys and roles. Now, let's go ahead and open up our identity and access management. We will actually use a little bit of the command line in Amazon EC2, but don't worry, we'll tell you how to do everything you need to do in order to demonstrate and understand these concepts. So if we come down to roles, let's take a look at what a role is. A role is something that something can assume and have those specific permissions. For example, an EC2 instance, when it starts up, can assume a role. And thus, it will have all of the permissions that apply to that role. So if I create a new role, and I'm going to call this my S3 access role, and then we'll do a next step. It's going to ask us what service role do we have. This means if we select EC2, it'll allow EC2 instances to call AWS services on your behalf. And then we'll be able to define which permissions are allowed in order for this to work. If you notice, there's lots of different AWS services that can assume a role. And it's very, very useful for us when it comes to working with Amazon Web Services. But we're going to start off with Amazon EC2. Now, you might also notice that we have role for cross-account access and role for identity provider access. A role for identity provider access will do something like allow us to integrate with an Active Directory SAML integration. So our single sign-on or an Active Directory server on an on-premise network can assume a role, because it integrates with our SAML provider. It can assume a role temporarily, giving a user within the Active Directory on your on-premise network access to the AWS console temporarily without having to create new AWS users. Let's just go ahead and start to understand these concepts with Amazon EC2. So we'll select a role. I can assign privileges to this role, whatever privileges I want. So for example, let's say I want Amazon S3 based privileges. Maybe I want read-only access, so we'll select next step. And then we'll create the role. So now that we have our S3 access, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to my users. Now, in order for API credentials to work, they have to be associated with an individual user. A role does not have API credentials. So if you have a developer that's developing an application code that's using the API credentials, or you're using the Amazon command line interface from an on-premise data center that can't assume a role because it's not an EC2 instance, then we need to have API credentials. So for example, I'm going to create a new user and I'm going to just call this my API test user. And I'm going to generate an access key for each user. I'm going to go ahead and download these credentials and copy them so I can access them here in just a moment. So we'll hit close and then we'll close the screen. Now again, remember API keys are never accessible again. I can't go into my user and download my API key. I can only see my access key. I cannot see my secret access key. However, what I can do is I can make the key inactive if I have an employee or an application I need to terminate, and I can also delete the key, or I can generate a new one. But unless you already have the secret access key, AWS will never display that for security purposes. So now to demonstrate how roles and the API keys work, now that we know how to create API keys and manage API keys, let's head over to Amazon EC2. So it's okay if you haven't done any Amazon EC2 yet. Just work with us. We have a default VPC. So we'll go ahead and launch a new instance. In order to do this, I'm going to select the Amazon Linux AMI, and then we'll select. From here, we'll just keep it a T2 micro. Now, as part of our EC2 section, we're going to learn all about this. So don't worry about it. Just go ahead and click Next, Configure Instance Details. Now, an IAM role can only be assumed by an EC2 instance when an EC2 instance is first created. Again, an IAM role can only be assumed by an EC2 instance when an EC2 instance is first created. That means we cannot change the IAM role on an EC2 instance. And it also means we cannot add an IAM role to an EC2 instance. That being said, an EC2 instance can only assume one IAM role at a time. So here, we're going to enable a public IP address so we can connect to our instance. And then we're going to select our S3 access IAM role. So what this is going to do is this makes it when our EC2 instance starts, it can assume the privileges of reading to Amazon S3. So we have S3 access. So next, we'll go ahead and add storage, tag instance, configure security group. We just want to make sure that we can access it through our port. So we will review and launch. We'll want to create a new key pair so we can access it. I'm just going to call it my Linux Academy course. And I'm going to download the key pair. We will need this in order to access the Linux command line on our EC2 instance. And let's launch our instance. So while this is launching, we're going to go ahead and wait for it to complete, and then we're going to connect to our EC2 instance. So now that it's running, let's go ahead and click on connect and select our connection string. Again, we would have needed to enable a public IP address in the creation process. So select enable on the subnet, and we have a public IP address. We need to make sure that we set change mod to either 400 or 600 on our Linux Academy course .pem key. And then we'll paste in our connection string in order to connect to Amazon EC2. So now that we're connected, I'm going to perform a sudo-su, a yum install python-pip. We're going to install the command line interface to demonstrate how roles work. Then we're going to do a pip install AWS CLI for the command line interface. Now that we've done this, I can do an AWS S3 LS, and it's actually going to return what's inside of my AWS account. Well, I don't currently have any buckets inside of Amazon S3. In fact, we're going to go ahead and create one using the command line interface. So if I go back to my IAM and I look at my role, this is the role my EC2 instance has assumed. I have read-only access. So we can attempt to create a bucket. We'll do AWS S3 MB for make bucket. We want to make the bucket called my bucket name Linux Academy. Now remember, bucket names are unique and cross the entire AWS infrastructure. So we have to make sure that we have a unique bucket name. Well, the problem here is we don't have access, right? The reason we don't have access is because we only have S3 read-only access. So if I attach a second policy and I attach S3 full access, because multiple policies can apply to an IAM role, a group, or a user account, and then if we come back over and attempt to create our bucket, we have successfully created the bucket because our role, which is assigned to our EC2 instance, has those permissions. So if we do an AWS S3 LS to list our buckets, we see that we have my bucket name, Linux Academy. Again, if we head over to our storage and content S3 service, we see that we have a bucket named my bucket Linux Academy. So now let's head back over to IAM. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of the privileges for my IAM role. And in fact, I'm going to just delete my IAM role. This means my EC2 instance can no longer use permissions associated with that IAM role. In fact, if you'll notice, we now have access denied. So let's say I wasn't using an EC2 instance. Let's say that this is an on-premise network or server. Let's say that this is your desktop machine. How can we then communicate with the AWS API or use the Amazon command line interface? Well, we have our users here. And we have this user API test that we created. Currently, it doesn't have any permissions on it. But what I can do is I can apply these API access keys to my account. Now, again, it's always best practice to never create or store API keys on an EC2 instance. So let's go ahead and do an AWS configure. And then we'll enter in our access key. Remember, I downloaded my access key, so I'll enter it in there. And then my secret access key. AWS only provides the secret access key one time. My default region I'm working out of is US East 1. And then we'll just keep format as none. So now what happens when we try to S3 LS, list our buckets inside of our S3 account? Well, this isn't going to work. The reason it's not going to work is because the user who has these API credentials does not belong to a group that has permissions. He also does not have his own permissions. So if I were to attach this user to a group, the admins group, which has power user access. And now I head back over. That policy that's attached to our admin group now applies to the API keys that I'm using because I'm using the API keys associated with my API test user. So now we'll do an ls, and we're able to list my bucket name, Linux Academy. So now you're starting to understand what API keys are and what IAM roles are. Again, try to think when you're architecting and designing applications for high availability, fault tolerance, and security, try to think when you can apply roles versus API keys. It's always better to use roles than it is API keys. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson.